You wake up and you're already tired. Not physically. Your body rested, but your mind, it never stopped. Before your eyes fully adjust to the light, something is already running in the background. A conversation from yesterday, something you said or didn't say, a message you're still waiting on, a problem that hasn't even happened yet. And just like that, your energy is gone before the day even begins. You haven't moved. You haven't worked. You haven't faced anything real, but somehow you already feel behind. So you reach for your phone, not because you need to, because you don't want to sit in that silence. You scroll. News, messages, opinion, other people's lives. Within minutes, your mind is no longer yours. It's reacting, comparing, absorbing things you didn't ask for and don't actually need. And here's the part most people miss. Nothing dramatic happened. No crisis. No emergency. But you're already drained, because the drain isn't coming from what you do. It's coming from what you're attached to. Attached to what people think. Attached to what might go wrong. Attached to things you cannot control. So you carry it. All day. In conversations. At work. In moments that should be simple. It's always there, pulling on your attention. Pulling on your energy. And the more you try to keep up, the more scattered you become. You tell yourself you need more discipline, more focus, more control. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is this. You're giving your energy away, constantly, without even noticing it. And until you see that clearly, you'll keep feeling exhausted in a life that shouldn't feel this heavy. Because it's not your schedule that's draining you. It's your attachments. And once you understand that, everything starts to shift. Most people think they're tired because life is demanding. Too much work. Too many responsibilities. Too many things to handle at once. But that's not what's actually draining you. It's what you're holding on to. Think about your day. How much of your energy goes to things you can't change? A comment someone made. A tone that felt off. A situation that didn't go your way. You don't just experience it, you carry it. You replay it. You analyze it. You build stories around it. And while you're doing all of that, your energy is quietly being spent. Not on action, on attachment. This is the part no one teaches you. Your mind doesn't just react to events, it clings to them. And every time it clings, it leaks. You think about someone who hasn't replied yet. Now your attention is split. You worry about something that might happen next week. Now your focus is gone. You compare yourself to someone online. Now your confidence drops. Nothing real has changed. But internally, everything has. And by the middle of the day, you feel it. That low-level exhaustion, that lack of clarity, that sense that you're busy, but not moving forward. Because your energy has already been spent in places that give you nothing back. Here's the truth most people avoid. You're not overwhelmed. You're scattered. Your energy is not being used. It's being drained. Small leaks. All day. Every reaction. Every unnecessary thought. Every attachment to something outside your control. And the worst part, it feels normal. Because you've been doing it for years. But the moment you start to see it, you can't unsee it. You begin to notice where your energy goes. And more importantly, where it doesn't need to go. Because once you stop leaking, you don't need more energy. You just need to keep what was already yours. Think of your energy like money. Every morning, you wake up with a full account. Not unlimited. Not renewable on demand. A fixed amount. And every decision you make spends it. Most people don't realize this, So they spend carelessly. They spend on things that give nothing back. A negative comment, that's a withdrawal. A pointless argument, another withdrawal. Scrolling through things that make you feel behind, more gone. By noon, they're already running low. Not because they worked hard, because they spent their energy on things that never deserved it. And here's the dangerous part. You don't see the transactions. There's no notification when your focus drops, no alert when your mood shifts, no warning when your clarity disappears. It just happens. Quietly. You start the day sharp and slowly become scattered. You start with intention and end up reacting because your energy has been pulled in too many directions. The Stoics understood this long before modern life made it worse. They didn't think in terms of time management. They thought in terms of attention management. Where your attention goes, your life follows. If your attention is constantly pulled outward, you lose control of your internal state. If your attention stays with you, you stay grounded. That's the difference. Most people let the world decide where their attention goes. Notifications, people, random thoughts. They react to everything and then wonder why they feel drained. But the man who becomes dangerous with his attention moves differently. He doesn't give it away easily. He doesn't react to everything. He chooses where it goes. And because of that, his energy stays with him. His focus stays sharp. His mind stays clear. Because he understands something simple but powerful. If you don't control where your energy goes, something else will. And it will take more than you realize. This is where most of your energy disappears. Not in work, not in problems, in people. Not because people are bad, but because you're too attached to how they see you, respond to you, and treat you. You want to be understood. You want to be respected. You want things to feel fair. So when someone doesn't meet that expectation, you feel it. A delayed reply becomes disrespect. A short answer becomes attitude. A disagreement becomes conflict. And just like that, your internal state shifts. Not because of what happened, because of what you made it mean. Now your energy is tied to them. What they said, what they meant, what they might be thinking. And the more you think about it, the deeper the attachment gets. This is how people control you without even trying. Not through force. Through your reaction. The Stoics saw this clearly. The moment you need someone to act a certain way for you to feel okay, you've given them power over you. And most people do this all day without realizing it. They need approval. They need agreement. They need validation. And when they don't get it, they lose themselves. But the man who learns to detach moves differently. He listens, but doesn't absorb everything. He engages, but doesn't get pulled into every emotion. He cares, but doesn't carry what isn't his. This doesn't make him cold. It makes him stable. He understands something most people don't. You are not responsible for how other people feel, act, or think. And once you truly accept that, something lifts. You stop chasing reactions. You stop overanalyzing behavior. You stop trying to control what was never yours. You show up as yourself and let others do the same. No force, no tension, no attachment. And that's when something changes. You're no longer easily moved by people, which means you're finally in control of yourself. There's something else draining you, and it's always within reach. Your phone, not just the device. What's inside it? A constant stream of opinions, updates, reactions, and noise that never stops. You wake up, and before you've had a single original thought, you've already consumed dozens of other people's news, messages, content designed to provoke something in you, anger, curiosity, comparison, and it works because your mind reacts automatically. You scroll for a few minutes and suddenly you're thinking about things that had nothing to do with your life. Someone else's success, someone else's problem, someone else's version of reality. And now your attention is gone, not stolen, given. This is the part most people don't see. You think you're just checking something quickly, but every notification, every post, every update is pulling you further away from yourself. And the more you engage, the harder it becomes to come back. Because now your mind is full of noise, full of comparison, full of things you never needed to carry. The Stoics never had this problem, but they understood the principle behind it. If something disturbs your peace, question its value. Most of what you consume every day has no value to your actual life. It doesn't move you forward. It doesn't make you better. It doesn't deserve your energy, but it takes it anyway, because you let it. Detachment here requires something most people avoid: discipline, the ability to sit in silence without reaching for stimulation, the ability to be alone with your thoughts without escaping them, the ability to choose what deserves your attention and ignore everything else. At first, it feels uncomfortable, almost unnatural, because you've trained your mind to expect constant input. But when you step away, even for a short time, something shifts. The noise fades. Your thoughts slow down. Your focus returns. And for the first time in a while, your mind feels like it belongs to you again. That's what detachment gives you. Not isolation, clarity. And in a world that profits from your distraction, clarity is power. There's one source of drain that's harder to see than all the others, because it doesn't come from people. It doesn't come from your phone. It doesn't come from the outside at all. It comes from you, or at least it feels like it does. That voice in your head, always talking, always commenting, always judging, telling you you're behind, telling you you should be further along, telling you what might go wrong before anything even happens. And most of the time, you believe it. You treat it like truth. But here's something most people never question. If you can hear that voice, then who is listening? Because they're not the same. You are not the voice. You are the one aware of it. The voice is just noise, a mix of past experiences, fears, expectations, and habits that have been repeating for years. It sounds convincing because it's familiar, but that doesn't make it real. The Stoics understood this in a simple but powerful way. They didn't try to fight every thought. They stepped back from it. They observed. Instead of saying, "This is true," they asked, "Is this useful?" That one shift creates distance. And in that distance, there's freedom. Because now the thought isn't controlling you. You're looking at it. Imagine your thoughts like passengers in a car. They can talk. They can complain. They can even panic. But they don't get to touch the steering wheel. You do. So the next time a thought shows up, "I'm going to mess this up. This isn't going to work. They're judging me." Don't argue with it. Don't suppress it. Just label it. I'm having the thought that. That small shift separates you from it. It reminds you that it's just a thought, not a fact. And the more you practice this, the quieter it becomes. Not because the voice disappears, but because it loses its authority. You stop obeying it. You stop reacting to every internal trigger. And for the first time, your mind isn't something that controls you. It's something you direct. And that changes everything. Understanding detachment is easy. Practicing it is where everything changes. Because in real moments, it doesn't feel like philosophy. It feels like pressure. Someone says something that hits you the wrong way. A notification pulls your attention. A thought starts looping in your head, and before you even realize it, you're already attached, already reacting, already losing energy. That's why this has to become training, not something you think about once, something you practice every day. Start simple. The next time you feel that pull, pause. Don't fix it. Don't respond immediately. Don't explain. Just notice it. That urge to react, that discomfort, that need to do something right now, stay with it. This is where most people break, because sitting in that moment feels unnatural. But that's exactly why it works. You're interrupting the pattern. Then create space. Take a breath. Slow your body down. Give yourself a few seconds before you move. Not to suppress the reaction, but to see it clearly. From there, redirect. Not the situation. Your attention. Ask yourself, does this deserve my energy? Most of the time, the answer is no. And when it's no, let it go. Not by forcing it away, but by choosing not to engage. This is the skill. Not controlling everything. Choosing what you participate in. You can train this in small ways. Leave your phone in another room for an hour. Sit in silence without reaching for stimulation. Notice your thoughts without following them. It doesn't look impressive, but it builds something powerful. Control. And over time, it compounds. The things that used to pull you in lose their grip. The reactions that used to feel automatic become optional. Until one day, you notice something different. You're not being dragged through your day anymore. You're moving through it on your terms. And that's when detachment stops being an idea. It becomes who you are. At some point, something changes. Not outside, inside. The same world is still there. People still act unpredictably. The noise is still constant. Distractions still exist everywhere you look, but they don't hit you the same way anymore. You notice things without absorbing them. You hear things without reacting to them. You experience moments without being controlled by them. There's space now between you and everything else. And in that space, there's peace. Not the fragile kind that disappears when something goes wrong. A stable kind. The kind that stays even when things don't go your way. You stop chasing responses from people. You stop needing validation from the world. You stop feeding every thought that enters your mind. And because of that, your energy stays with you. You move differently. Calmer, clearer, more deliberate. You don't rush to respond. You don't feel the need to prove anything. You don't get pulled into every situation that demands your attention. And people notice, not because you're trying to stand out, but because you're not reacting like everyone else. In a world where most people are constantly triggered, you're steady. In a world where attention is scattered, you're focused. In a world where people are easily moved, you're grounded. This is what real detachment looks like. Not isolation, not indifference. Control. Control over what you engage with. Control over what you carry. Control over what gets your energy. You're no longer a product of everything around you. You're the one deciding what matters. And once you reach that point, something becomes clear. You don't need to escape the world to find peace. You just need to stop letting it inside you. So don't try to change everything at once. Start small. One reaction, one moment, one decision not to engage, and build from there. Because this isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming someone who cannot be easily shaken. If you're ready to take that step, type "I detach" in the comments. And if you're serious about building this level of control, make sure you subscribe, because this isn't about motivation, it's about mastery.